Okay, we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to the third annual Rebel Satori Press World AIDS Day reading with a book release. Now you can. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Coordination. For anyone who doesn't know, although I think most of you do, we are an independent queer bookstore that has been in existence since 2012, just celebrated our 12th anniversary. We're still here. And we're all volunteer. Today we are being helped by Jeffrey Archer. So as an all-volunteer organization, we are dependent on sales and donations to keep this boat afloat. So I'm going to pass the bag around. If you're able to throw something in, we appreciate it. There's also a QR code if you'd like to give on Venmo, especially if you know you won't be buying any books. If you can buy books and make a donation, we encourage you to do so. But if not, please support us in one way or another. And for those of you online, if you'd like to make a donation, you can do so on Venmo at BGSQD. If you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room by the register or on our website, which is bgsqd.com. And our regular business hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. All right. So before I bring up our first reader, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a statement of solidarity with the people of Palestine. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a queer issue. As queer people, we know the pain of being cast out. We have been and continue to be despised by many, even by our own parents, families, and communities of origin. This reality evokes in many of us a deep empathy with others who are likewise seen not as fully human, but as problems to be solved, questions for which the answer is ultimately elimination and erasure. As we watch the ongoing genocide of Palestinians by the State of Israel, carried out with the full support of our government and funded by our tax dollars, we witness the inevitable results of defining a people solely as a threat to the safety and well-being of those deemed inherently worthy of life. This horror compels us to speak out not only against the current bombardment and siege of Gaza by the State of Israel, but against the historical and ongoing violent displacement of Palestinians by Zionists and the conditions of occupation and apartheid under which Palestinians have been forced to live for over 75 years. In our longing for a very different reality, we take inspiration from the words of Jose Esteban Munoz, who wrote, "Queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world." And that is from his 2009 book, Cruising Utopia. which I recommend to all of you. And with that, I will bring up our first reader, Jerry Rothko, who will be reading from the new introduction to Facing It. Please give him a warm welcome. He doesn't have unlocked on the phone, so you're good. I'm here to adjust.
Okay, I like to say. Some of us lost 100 people to AIDS. Some are caregivers, and some were activists. But we also should remember, and there's a lot here, creative people did a lot to push AIDS far into the future, the story of AIDS, which is important. In the early 80s, Paul Reed was a young guy in his 20s living in San Francisco with his lover, Tom. And he was working for 10 Speed Press and writing a novel, writing his first novel. And in 1984, Gay Sunshine Press published Facing It, a novel of AIDS, focused on the domestic life of a young gay couple and their friends and how they reacted step by step to this tragic occurrence. The book presents a domestic story gone wrong. The happy relationship of Andy Stone and David Markman comes apart piece by piece as David's health fails. They and their friends pass through stages of confusion, fear, denial, until they face what's happening. Reed would write 2 more novels, but his own health was changing. And so over the next 3 years, he focused on fighting AIDS in all kinds of ways. And he brought out the book, Serenity, Support and Guidance for People with HIV, their families, friends, and caregivers. And that got him some notice. But as his own health was becoming challenging, he seemed to be invulnerable in some ways. He was a real tough guy with just the ability to survive anything. And for example, he was in a safe sex club during an earthquake. And on October 27th, 1989, he was driving a car over the Bay Bridge when the car swerved into the next lane. He thought he blew a tire, but realized instead other cars were also out of control. It was a big earthquake. He took the nearest exit just as a section of the bridge collapsed, plunging a fellow driver to his death. During 1988-89, Reed's lover Tom was suffering from end-term AIDS, and Paul was his main caregiver. Tom died in January 1990 with Paul by his side. A big question that some people may remember is people had to decide when to get off AZT. And it's all people had for years. In England, they would only let people use it for 6 months because it was so toxic. He had it for 2 years, and he was looking for some other kind of treatment and found out about compound Q, which is a Chinese drug that it's a pretty tough course. You have to have a 2-hour infusion over 8 months. And he did it, and it had mixed results, but he didn't want to do another 8 months like that. But he did bring out a book, the Q Journal, a treatment diary. And at the same time, about the same time, the Serenity book came out again. So he was getting some attention, but now his health had dropped another notch. And He took DDC, didanomacin, which is an alternative to AZT, but he was still battling shingles, bronchitis, neuropathy, fatigue, ocular migraines, which caused a few hours of blindness, stomach cramps, and more. Finally, he decided he could live on AZT and saving, and resigned from his job, devoting himself to his health and writing. That was another big decision people back then. Doesn't seem so long ago, but they had to decide when to go on disability, when to give up. Good job in a lot of cases. Reed's next diary, The Savage Garden, covered his political activism, including ACT-UP meetings and protests, a new interest in spirituality with like-minded friends, punk rock concerts, and nature in visits to the Russian River, Yosemite, and Mexico. The Redwood Diary is Reed's last diary, covering April 1995 to March 1996. This is a book about the loss and renewal of hope. He owned and rode a motorcycle for a while until he didn't have the strength to work the gears or hold it up at a red light. It seemed a bad omen. Reed thinks, woke up this morning thinking about how many of my writer friends have died fairly recently. John Preston, Tiro Witomsky, Paul Monet, Bo Used, Stan Leventhal, George Stembelian. Another time he thinks of lovers who were both writers, Michael Grumley and Robert Farrow. Strange to think of Grumley and Farrow now, to remember just how many friends are gone. David Summers and George Whitmore among them. My last conversation with Robert occurred just 2 weeks after Michael died. I phoned my condolences, and Robert was cold, distant, his voice faint, the life gone out of him. I asked him how he was doing. He sighed, I'm here, just here. A close friend is named Cap. Reed reveals Cap is dying on a morphine drip. He called to say goodbye. I'm not feeling too well adjusted for this. Makes me mighty sad. Another low point. Spent the morning at the Shanti Project, a support organization for terminally ill people. They took all his information and put him on a waiting list to get a volunteer for end-stage care. Calling on Shanti has driven the point home. I'm dying. But once again, borrowed time wraps its arms around him. By the end of the diary, protease inhibitors are reversing the condition of many AIDS patients. Paul writes, a tremendous amount of energy has returned to me, and I'm able to go places on my own and complete chores effortlessly. In quiet celebration, Paul and his friend Matt took a drive to the Russian River in the early spring. About the same time, my late lover Jack was in a study for protease inhibitors, and they helped all those people. But Jack, at the first sign of lymphoma, they had to take him off the study. He called me with that phone call. Reed passed away unexpectedly, January 28, 2002. At the end of the Redwood Diary, Reed says he doesn't want his work to be seen as mostly about AIDS. He hopes for a balance. It is my hope that I have not dwelt overly in the matter of AIDS and therapies. The answer must be that his work covers plenty of life's traditional themes, but AIDS is his essential theme. And the best of it remains the simple, truthful novel facing it.
Everyone, please welcome. It is an honor for everyone to be here today, but please welcome Philip F. Clark, who will read from Paul Reed's Facing It.
It's wonderful to be with you on this very important day. And I always thank Greg and Donnie for giving us a space to keep our voices alive, whether they are gone or to come. This is a space for those voices. God bless you for it. When I first read Facing It in 1984, or it might have been 1985, I can honestly say the book scared the hell out of me. People at that time were unsure of things, rumoring. There were all these things going on that we knew and did not know and hoped to know, but we were frightened. We were absolutely frightened. And what Paul Reed did in this book was make us face the mirror. He made the politicians face the mirror. He made the doctors face the mirror. Everybody, families, face the mirror. Father, face the mirror. And part of reading it now, all this time later, it still has the same effect on me. We have progressed, so many good things have happened. But you cannot forget, there may still be people in this country, in this world, who are experiencing that still. So don't forget, Paul Reed gave us that heads up. And I'll read 2 excerpts from the book. In the front room, Chuck Stone stood at the window for a moment. He trembled in his fury and pain, but he couldn't let go. He put the palm of his hand against his forehead and set his mouth in a grimace. It was becoming difficult for him to ignore his feelings. He loved Andy so very much, more than anyone knew. To think that his son was dying under these circumstances. Chuck Stone sobbed and choked back the tears. He was right, he knew. He believed what he said, no matter his feelings. And so he got hold of himself, wiped the love from his cheek, and stared out the window. February 1982, New York City. David returned to New York a few days later. January had already passed into February, a cold, dark time of the year when the brightness of spring and summer seems nothing more than a bad humor. David's trip to San Francisco had been more an exercise in frustration than coverage of the epidemic. He had, all told, been more or less favorably impressed by Kinder Mann and his work at UCSF. And he had been touched deeply by a struggling organization. The Kaposi Sarcoma Foundation, housed in tiny offices overlooking Castro Street. But the story didn't have enough appeal for David, not anymore. For the repetition of the same story over and over was wearing thin. As Andy's own health diminished, as David had to face it more in his everyday life, the epidemic as it related to others held less interest for him. He suddenly found that he wanted out of the involvement with the paper. He was tired of repeating the miserable story in relation to other people, because now, with Andy's worsening condition, he did not relish having it on himself. Now that he, and especially Andy, had reached some sort of accord, he wished only to see what it was fulfilled and done with. David found that, as he had feared and known in his gut, Andy had worsened terribly. There had been a new and sudden proliferation of KS lesions all over his body, and the staph infection had broken down and out again in his groin. Andy showered Andy showed the red pustular sores and the KS lesions to David the evening he returned from San Francisco. David had looked reluctantly. It was approaching overload. "This is it," Andy said to David, broaching the subject. There were facts he had to relate, and none of it could wait. "I wouldn't tell you this on the phone, but I have to go into the hospital in the next few days. Dr. Branch just diagnosed pneumocystis pneumonia." "No," David gasped, tears abruptly running down his cheeks. He found it hard to accept this final and long-awaited moment when Andy would be hospitalized. All the tension of his trip welled up and overflowed at that moment. David felt overwhelmed. "How so fast?" he asked feebly. Andy opened his mouth to answer, but then said nothing. David accepted the silence, but he couldn't control his tears. He was filled with conflicting feelings: hope, based on the work he had seen in San Francisco; fear that he would lose Andy soon; frustration from the inertia surrounding the epidemic's resolution; and anger that the world was simply not fair. David was tired, weary. He looked blankly at Andy, inquisitive. Andy spoke softly. "This is it, David. I have to go into Mount Zion so they can treat the pneumonia and the staph and the cancer, continue the cobalt and the chemotherapy." "No," David sighed the word, hardly spoke it. Andy spoke even more softly. "I may refuse treatment. I haven't decided. It may be best at this point to accept it and press on." His voice trailed off as he watched David suffering. He had not known he would suffer so much pain. But then, of course, what could he expect? David's mind was working denial and hope, but his conscious mind brought him round again and again to the facts. Couldn't Andy stick it out just a while longer until perhaps Kinderman found the virus? But no, that wouldn't do. It wouldn't happen. Andy would go fast now. David knew the pattern. The onset of a serious decline in the condition signaled the start of what David knew to be a death sentence for Andy, for all so far. He would have to face it somehow. "David!" It was Andy shouting, standing before David and yelling his name. "David, snap out of it. Lord knows I never expected to have to be the strong one at this point." He didn't finish the sentence. David looked up at his lover, so pale and thin, so dignified as he faced the severity of his illness. And David realized that he had no right to behave as he was, to draw away into his own world of selfish cares and fears. That he should be the strong one, David said to himself. That he should be the strong one. David was filled with a sudden strength, a vitality borrowed from Andy's dignity. What had seemed so pathetic only a moment before, Andy's ghastly gray pallor, his thinning hair, the hideous lesions on his skin. What had seemed so pathetic now seemed the inverted symbol of Andy's strength. He has stuck it out, David told himself. He's been strong and faced it at every turn, while I ran and hid in my fucking press coverage of the damn crisis. It was nothing new, really, but it was for David one of those rare and triumphant moments of crystal clarity, when the tragedies as well as victories of the world somehow fit. A moment when David saw that what had already been accomplished had been good, had been real. He stood and held Andy close, saying nothing. It was a moment when the whole of Andy's illness became a true reality when both of them saw together that they had weathered a storm, and moreover, that there was more to come. They accepted Andy's illness, and they gathered their strength for what was left. Thank you.
Now we will hear from the other Philip Clark, no F. Philip Clark will talk about invisible history and read a selection of Walter's work. Please welcome Philip.
First off, thanks, of course, to Greg and to Donnie and to BGSQD for continuing to host these kinds of readings and for being very supportive of books by writers who are no longer with us. Those are sometimes, harder, especially when the writers are a little obscure, like a Paul Reed or a Walter Borowski, to promote that kind of thing and to sell those kinds of things. And I'm glad that a place like BGSQD is so open to hosting these kinds of readings and stocking these kinds of books. So thank you. I'm going to dedicate the reading that I give today to my friend Jim Corey, a Philadelphia poet who passed away at the beginning of October. Jim was a very close friend of mine, and discussions with him and reading some of his writing was a big influence on the introduction that I wrote to Walter's Invisible History, the collected poems of Walter Borowski. And I decided that given the state of the country and the world at the moment, that I'm going to read a different kind of section of work of Walter's than I've typically performed at readings from the book. We're going to go political today. And I wanted to start by reading a piece of the introduction to the book, which I structure around different elements of Walter's history. And I'm going to read a small section of the part that is called political history, to give a little bit of a grounding to who Walter was and to the poems that are to come. Leaving Pachogi, New York for his late 60s campus adolescence, during a time of ongoing national and global ferment, Walter ultimately emerged into the moment of gay liberation. The period directly post-Stonewall saw an explosion of political and social organizing in major cities, but also saw the expansion of more open gay cultural production. From Sebastian Quill and Manroot in San Francisco, to Mouth of the Dragon and Christopher Street in New York, to anthologies from Crossing Press, the male muse, and Gay Sunshine, Angels of the Lyre, and Orgasms of Light, multiple venues emerged for gay poetry. Walter participated in the Boston-based radical collective Fag Rag, founded by Charlie Shively, and its publishing offshoot, Good Gay Poets. The press began by publishing John Wiener's in 1972. Its last book was Walter's Sexually Dangerous Poet in 1984. Walter became part of a vibrant community of poets in and around Boston. David Eberly, Salvatore Farinella, Freddie Greenfield, Rudy Keuchel, Pat Curris, Ron Schreiber, David Emerson Smith. And I should mention that both David Emerson Smith and Salvatore Farinella passed from AIDS. By the time he was publishing regularly in the late 1970s, poets were exploring all facets of gay identity. Living in a society that largely refused to acknowledge gay relationships, community, or history, he became adept at locating and resurfacing the hidden and the suppressed. Set in New Hampshire, a pair of poems at the center of Sexually Dangerous Poet contrast this prior repression with the new and momentous openness to which Walter and others were committed. In Live Free or Die, his meeting with the ghost of a gay man who never knew love shifts the connotations of the state motto from the Revolutionary War to a different kind of necessary revolution. The ghost guides him to see bottled gentian in a country meadow. Mimicking the position of so many gay men stifled by their society, its flowers are genetically programmed, never to open. On the opposing page, in Power of One, Walter's presence in the state leads to epic destruction, from blight to hurricanes to the maiming of hunters' dogs, all because there's a faggot in New Hampshire. In this satire of straight society's fears and his other politicized poems, Walter heralds a new generation of publicly gay men not content to remain hidden. That doesn't mean that there isn't a cost or that there can't be a cost from being open. So the first poem that I'm going to read of Walta's, of two, is going to be one that's dedicated to one of those poets I mentioned as being part of this circle. It's dedicated to Rudy Keuchel. And the poem is called Some of Us Wear Pink Triangles. At the Lesbian and Gay Pride March, we strode through Main Street shouting, 2, 4, 6, 8, gay is just as good as straight. Their hundreds looked at our thousands. Some threw insults, some supported, most were silent. We were noisy inside the shelter of numbers. Balloons flew into the face of the sky, forcing all to see. We are everywhere. At a dinner party in Somerville, 8 of us sit talking about music, gay politics, gay literature, gay love. In the conversation's first lull, we hear it. First come wolf whistles, then, hey, why don't you guys look out? Lots of beautiful guys on the sidewalk down here. You're talking about Anita Bryan up there, drinking any orange juice? Hey, play us some more Beethoven. We look at each other, trying to find words. Rudy talks of gays beat up after trying to throw a gay straight party. Kenny's been hit by a beer bottle the night before. He'd had his arm about a man. We all have our stories. Then thud. Patrick hears it. I hear it. Something's been thrown against the house. Twice more it happens. And laughter. And whistles. And then, good night, guys. See you tomorrow. Already we've been moving from windows and changing the subject. But there's no room for music now, and literature seems removed. No matter how real Henry James can make a character, we have to deal with characters in the street. We have to get from here to there and worry about survival between Ball and Harvard squares. Once Bruce told me he'd try gay sex, only he'd never want to be branded homosexual. I used to laugh. And for the second and last poem I'll read, I'm imagining, just based on the title, this was probably created around 1977 when the Star Wars craze was going on. But its title is It's Earth Wars Worry Me. And in case it isn't clear from the poem, he mentions the name Dean Wyckoff a couple of times. Wyckoff was a functionary for Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. It's in 5 pieces, so I'll say a number or give a number as I go. It's Earth Wars Worry Me. 1. Exterminate homosexuals? Walter, you were so paranoid. Blonde and young, he glared at me, incredulous. I, with no patience to explain, Nazis preceded the American Party for Manhood, and before them, and after them, and right now, Dean Wyckoff, the Moral Majority, Christians to burn us as witches. They see us, and with hard-ons tied between their legs, say we should die for being kinky. These walls, no apples fall over them. We can't make love here. Lights and guns. 2. Dead faces, gaping holes, history. Rats in the catacombs. Prediction. 3. MIT's Pi Lambda Phi frat marches through Harvard Square demanding death for gays. A joke, they tell reporters. There are no accidents, says Andrea, and there are no jokes, just straight people. Anne Frank didn't need a diary, wrote Charlie Shively years ago. She needed a hand grenade. 4. Archaic Catholics call their ancestors angels, call us occasions of sin. Our promiscuous faces, our lascivious eyes invite them to sin. Sin. We are our own icons. We are faggots. They want faggots to burn. 5. If San Francisco slides into the sea, Dean Wyckoff will say it was because so many gay people were allowed to live there, and people who lose property in that slide will not want it to happen again. Gays are expected to let things happen. The church burns us, we rise. Hitler exterminates the gays of Europe, we rise. With losses unremembered, with contributions masked. Oh, Emily was an odd spinster. Old Walt was a bit weird. We rise, we rise, we rise, we rise.
Before I introduce our next guest, I just want to say thank you for your voices. Take my glasses off so I can see you. Thank you for your voices. Thank you for being in the space. Thank you for being part of what Greg and I dreamt up to make happen. And as we remember everyone that we've lost, I also want to say that we are still living with HIV/AIDS. And people are still handling their lives, and we need to support everyone. And this election has caused me to evaluate the context of my life and growing up in the South, and particularly in New Orleans, and how to cope with what is happening. So we need to be together with everyone. And I want to thank you for your voices, because those of us who are up here sharing the work of those past, you've shared your own works and you've given us life. And I can say a lot about you. You've enchanted me. You've given your voice to the space, entertained audiences. Please keep doing that. Scott? Please welcome, who has an enchanting, mesmerizing voice and art, Scott Hightower will read a selection of Walta's poetry.
Thank you to the organizers of this. It's always a great honor to be asked to read to the community. The luck of the draw. Sometimes gloom itself acts as a muse. It begins as a bad mood, then expands to meditative misery from which poetic thought proceeds. It could also lead to suicide. This is the barbed wire fence some of us straddle, our eyes seeking star constellations, our crotches bloodied, our inner selves mutilated, awaiting miracles, his call. Legend has it, when Jack Parr asked Judy Garland how it felt to be a legend, she cleared her throat and said hoarsely, "It's peculiar." A consummate singer, she knew the weight of the word, the designation of intonation, sometimes a drunken slur, a drugged pause, an awkward silence 2 beats too long, denote damaged brilliance, the luck of the fall, of falling. It's peculiar, she said. They think, oh, we can't call her. She's a legend. And I sit by the phone Saturday nights, waiting for it to ring. Occluded front. No, I've never had you. I've become a master of giving you up. The first time I saw you, I wanted you to have sex with me. I wasn't expecting miracles. I didn't assume you'd reverse my AZT impotence. I merely saw my brothers in you and anticipated a great intimacy. I did what I had to do to meet you, discovered you had this hectic schedule. I could not see you except when I managed to meet you at our mutual gym or chance encounters in our shared neighborhood. Even then, I had to guard the distance between us from me so as not to frighten you with my intensity, my obvious desire. I danced in place for you, allowed my gestures and words to express fondness with great respect for your detachment. I feared losing you altogether. You're transient in the community of my living and dying. But oh, in my head, we live in a rural haven where time is immaterial. My inappropriate infatuation, your lack of it matters little. We're both gentlemen. We periodically lock eyes, sharing what cannot be scheduled or misinterpreted. We've never fought, but the print of you tattoo on my soul. Someday you'll be in the shower, or alone, or with someone else in your bed. You'll notice odd markings on the inside of your eyelids, the private places no one goes. You'll see me. Twilight. Twilight blue has ever been my favorite time of day. The gentle dwindle of light, soft tones, eerie even, evening's well-appointed threshold, without the scary contrasts of dawn and night. Last one. He lost his ability to write, and so this was his final poem. It was dictated to someone else. They were there. The one is called Michael, I Miss You So Much, as dictated to Chris Whitkey. Michael, I miss you so much. The storm makes me miss you more than ever. Please come home to me and keep me warm in this scary winter night. The night is too long without you. Even the wind, which normally I find comforting, is just scary without your arms. I miss you so much. Nights seem so incredibly long and empty without you. Incredibly long and empty. Boy, is that a bad line, but I mean it. But at the moment, even Harry's exquisite food has not tempted you home to my arms. Thank you.
Next up, we have Gerard Cabrera reading a selection of Walter's poems. Please welcome Gerard.
Thank you, Greg and Donnie, and thank you to the Bureau for hosting this third annual reading. It's very important that we come every year and remember. And I'm going to be reading 3 of Walter's poems. I met Walter. I was a junior at Brandeis University. One of my classmates is here in the audience tonight, which is very meaningful to me. So first one is called Propriety. George has a motorbike. I won't go on it. Not because George never had a car license, and this is a whole new thing, but in my youth, Victor Clayman took me for so many rides, I bought my own crash helmet. And when we pulled into my father's garage next to the Nova, I'd pull Victor down on the sawdust on the motor oil, suck his cock, his big, handsome arms wrapped round my shoulders, my fingers sliding into his wide ass. He always came so much more slowly than he drove. Even so, we both kept our helmets on. As you can see, Walt had a very nice sense of humor. Role model. Father says I should try harder to be more like Rory Calhoun. I still intend to be Elizabeth Taylor. Though mother has never fully forgiven her, even after the near fatal tracheotomy, for stealing Eddie Fisher from Debbie Reynolds. I imagine myself in violet dresses with violet contact lenses and the largest diamonds outside the Tower of London, jewelry box to that other lesser Liz. I too would toss 39 carats like a stereotypical cheerleader her steadies class ring, loosely on a vulgar chain, tick-tock, expensive pendulum as I pass by, ogled, heavily insured. They would say I'm too fat. I'd say, so what's Twiggy's last name? I'd keep frightfully well-framed renderings of my 7 husbands, hard-ons, nude on the piano. Barbara Cook would giggle when she came round to sing songs they'd never let me record, simply because my voice could not possibly match my face. Even my pets would be exotic. Ocelots, unchained tigers, talking birds with vocabularies unexpectedly salty as my own. For what is fantasy but the stroke of fate, of face that leaves one person taking orders in a pizza joint, another a queen. And the last poem I'm going to read is called For Emily Dickinson and Charlie Shively, who was mentioned before as the founder of Fag Rag. I saw 2 men and wanted both, but neither wanted me. And that is the extent of my promiscuity.
All right. Chris Bram will read from his introduction to Alan Barnett's The Body and Its Dangers. Please welcome Chris to the stage.
Hey, again, thank Donnie and Greg and the Bureau for putting this together. I thank Tom Cardiman and Rebel Satori Press for putting this together. I'm really honored to be here. And more moving than I expected. I'm surprised by how much emotion I'm feeling. So thank you all. So I'm just, okay. So this is from introduction to Alan Barnett, the reissue of Alan Barnett's The Body and Its Dangers. This book of 6 short stories created a nice little stir when it first came out in 1990. It not only won both major gay literary prizes, the Lambda Book Award and the Pharaoh Grumley, it received a special citation from Penn's Ernest Hemingway Foundation. It was widely reviewed in the mainstream press. One story, Philosophy, now obscure, even appeared in the New Yorker. AIDS was the major reason for the attention. 4 of the stories deal directly with the epidemic, which cast its shadow over the other 2. The plague was still in its first decade, and readers, gay readers especially, were looking for fiction that addressed what was devastating their lives. This book did exactly that, not in raw slices of pain, but with quiet craft and perfect prose. That was the other reason for the attention. It was so beautifully written, the language stylish yet warm, with solid rhythms and well-constructed sentences. Quote, you let go of people, the living and the dead, and return to yourself, your own resources, like a widower, a tourist alone in a foreign country. Your own senses become important and other people's sensibilities a kind of Novocaine, blocking out your own perceptions, your ability to discriminate, your taste, unquote. But Barnett was not afraid to be funny or smartass. The age quilt is described as, quote, a foldable, dry cleanable cemetery. A lesbian mother tells us about her boy crazy daughter. My daughter thinks that lesbianism is next to laziness. She thinks this requires no effort. Short stories are often treated as poor cousins of novels, yet the stories here are rich and full, like concentrated short novels. The digressive, episodic construction of each tale recalls Alice Munro at her best. The panels of story don't always come in the pattern we expect, but can suddenly swing left or right, like the movement of a knight on a chessboard. Two stories follow the same set of characters, but the others stand free. Nevertheless, like Munro, the repetitions and variations on certain experiences create the fuzzy outline of an author, like the invisible man seen walking in the rain. I wanted to write pure literary criticism here, but I'm leaving out something very important. I knew Alan. I thought I could discuss this work in the impersonal language of high literature, but it doesn't feel right. It feels false to even call him Barnett. Alan and I were good friends during the last year of his life. We began by talking about books, our own and other people's. When he became sick with AIDS, I visited him in the hospital. Later, at his apartment, I tried to help him figure out the complicated IV drip and bags of saline solution and the syringes needed to clean out the port in his chest. Alan could no longer write once he was ill. All the experience in his book came from the illness of friends and his warm imagination. When he died in 1991, he left me his computer. I wrote my next 3 novels on it, including Gods and Monsters. My protagonist, movie director James Whale, served in the trenches during the First World War. I gave Alan's last name to one of Whale's dead comrades. It's strange now, and wonderful too, to hear Ian McKellen in the movie deliver his extraordinary speech about dead friends and speak of Barnett on the wire. I did not reread Alan's stories for years, perhaps because I feared they might not be as good as I remembered. It's been a joy to go back to his book for this essay and see Alan, the author, as well as Alan, the friend. He was an amazing writer, even better than I thought at the time. I would love these stories even if I didn't know him. They deserve to be read and reread, not only because they capture life in the age of AIDS so well, but because they have a moral weight that transcends a moment in time.
That is J.P. Howard, who will also read from Barnett's work.
Thanks again to Greg and Donnie for having us here, to the Bureau, and just to the wonderful audiences here as well, and of course, Tom for organizing this. I'm going to read from The Body and Its Dangers, which is a short story, the title of the book. I'm going to bring the lesbian mother perspective. The story goes. My daughter is at an age, she is beginning to realize that she is the end result of something significant. Sex is not the issue, cause and effect is. She wants to know more about her father than I can tell her. She resents how few men I have brought into her life. Marie and I had to take her out of public school because she was so obsessed with boys. A teacher caught her leading the other girls in song. We are the girls of the 4th grade horror corps. We are the girls that the boys pay more for. My daughter thinks that lesbianism is next to laziness. She thinks this requires no effort. My daughter also thinks that camouflage fatigues and army surplus boots are fashions original to her generation. Though I can't remember why I wore them, the uniform of the oppressor. Was it to protest the war, Or was it the first stirring of a radical feminism? Though we may not remember our issues, there is no forgetting that we once had them. My daughter will not wear contact lenses because she says they make her eyes too big. She complains that her neck is ugly. If she knew how beautiful she is, she would not worry about boys. She could sit at a window with a book or needlepoint, and they would come to her, of course. She hates it when I say such things. What did I hate at her age? My name, and my sisters hated theirs. Rebecca, Ruth, Esther, Judith. Our mother loved our mournful names, redolent of Sunday school and the Old Testament. One pores over the book of Genesis to pick them out. They are rare. You have to assume the role of women, the wombs responsible for the sons of Japheth, the sons of Gomer, of Javan, Cush, and Nimrod. My mother named me Sarah. I let her name my daughter Rachel, knowing that would help her love a baby she saw as born in sin. I knew she would refuse to realize that abortion was an option I hadn't taken. Rachel has accused Marie and me of making her father gay, which made Marie laugh until tears ran down her cheeks. But it hurts Marie, I can tell. She interprets Rachel's curiosity as incrimination. Rachel has kept us a family all these years, the way children are supposed to. If Marie had had a child of her own, perhaps she would not be dependent on me. Rachel calls Marie Mama with the accent on the second syllable and asks her questions about Papa, whom Marie also knew in the biblical sense. Timing and other accidents made Rachel my child as opposed to hers. As it stands, it is almost as if Rachel was born to Marie, the way Sarah bore Abraham, their son Isaac. And if Gordon had been a woman, and I and Marie men, there wasn't a blood test invented at the time that could determine parentage. Last year, for Rachel's 15th birthday, I visited the theater department where I met her father. In their archives, I found slides of a production we were in together, The Garden. There was a picture of him as Abel. I'm hidden behind him, playing the sheep. I had a picture made from the slide and presented it to Rachel. Here's your father, darling, I said. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she cried out, but he's just a little boy. A conclusion with which I couldn't argue. Maybe that was the one I wanted her to make herself. Children make you think less often of yourself, and illness makes you think of yourself all the time. Your body determines the subject of conversation, so to speak. I knew Rachel would never have a father, and Marie saying Rachel would have something better, two moms, a la Sean O'Casey, wanted her as much as I did. I think Marie prayed for a girl, a little Amazon. I'm the Amazon now. One breast removed, no obstruction to the bow and arrow. If indeed there was anything I would shoot, that was 6 months ago. I'm not long for the other breast either, or it for me. Marie and Rachel have become like twin moons, their orbits closer to one another than to mine. Though I know I hold them to me still, Marie has been going to women's music festivals and book fairs since my diagnosis, to lesbians in the arts and women in theater conferences at Champaign-Urbana, in Madison, in Bloomington. She leaves on a Thursday, returns late on Sunday, taking Rachel with her, who usually abhors such things, the idea of them, the very thought of a separate world for women. Of course, they both ask me whether I mind, if I will be all right. I say, go, go. I need to be alone now. There's healing to be done. So they leave thinking that they have satisfied my needs. And for 3 days, Rachel will stop confusing the word Genesis and genocide with genetics. If with her absence, Marie betrays me, she does no more than my body has. I have to tell her that I have yet to tell her that the cancer has yet spread to my bones, my lungs. What is left for it? The heart? Perhaps the body is just a shell, but what is there to make us think that except a body in a casket, death process, or some disfigurement? In the meantime, I am my body, and Marie loved me. I'm glad she did. I loved my body too. Thank you.
Thank you, JP. Dale Corvino will read more of Alan's work. Please welcome Dale to the stage.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you to the Bureau, and also thank you to Tom and the Library of Homosexual Congress for introducing you to this work. We would have been contemporaries had he lived, and I found his voice vital and heartbreaking, and also full of that dry, sharp humor that you know is gay humor. You just know. So this is a bite from a short story entitled The Times as It Knows Us. And the Times in the story is the New York Times, which covered the AIDS crisis by covering up the AIDS crisis, putting all the news in the back, and the obituaries often read after a short illness. And it's also the times that are enfolded into the text. So the past, which is recalled with a sort of pathos, and the present, which is full of funerals and a lexicon of names of new drugs and new conditions, and a future which seems foreclosed. It's a very New York story. It's set in Fire Island, our queer refuge, but its shores could not save us. I can't tell you how bored I am with all of this. A man said to me on the beach one evening when he learned that another friend had gone down for the count. He said, "Sometimes I wish there was something else to talk about, which is what my mother used to say when she put her makeup on for a night out with my father. I just wish we could go out and talk about anything but you kids and the house." She'd say with a vague longing, I recall, with numbing resonance, "I just wish there was something else to talk about." They would eat at a place called D'Amico's, where the menus were as large as parking spaces. She would have frog's legs, which she told me tasted like chicken, but they were still a leap towards the exotic, no matter how familiar the landing. Her desire had no specific object. She was not an educated woman. She did not even encourage fantasy in her children. But it still arouses whatever edible thing there is left in resolve in me, and I often wish to be able to satisfy it, to give her nights and days of conversation so rooted in the present that no reference to when we were not happy could ever be made, and no dread of what was to come could be imagined. But we both know there's no forgetting that we were once unhappy. Our conversation is about my sister's lives and their children. She ends our infrequent telephone conversations with, "Please take care of yourself," emphasizing without naming her fear of losing me to an illness we still haven't talked about, or to the ebbs of time and its hostilities that have carried me further and further away from perfect honesty with her. But language also takes you far afield. Metaphors adumbrate, facts mitigate. For example, nothing is hopeless. We must hope for everything. I had believed this until I realized the lie of its intrinsic metaphor, that being without hope is not being, plunged into the abyss that nothingness fills. We have not come so far since the world had one language and few words. Babel fell before we had a decent word for death, and then we were numb, shocked at the thought of it. And this lisping, dumb word, death, 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 was the best we could come up with. And simply speak, disinterested and dryly, the words that fill your daily life. Lewis has chaos of the lungs, or Raymond has endocarditis, but the surgeons won't operate, or Howard's podiatrist will not remove a bunion until he takes the test, or cytomegalovirus has inflamed his stomach and we can't get him to eat, or the DHPG might restore sight in his eye, or the clinical trial for Ampligen has filled up, or they've added dementia to the list of AIDS-related illnesses, or the AZT was making him anemic, or his psoriasis flaked so badly the maid wouldn't clean his room, or they found tuberculosis in his glands, or it's a form of meningitis carried in pigeon shit. His mother told him he never should have gone to Venice, or the drug's available on a compassionate basis, or the drug killed him, or his lung collapsed and stopped his heart, or this is the beginning of his decline, or he was so young. What have you said, and who wants to hear it? Oh, your life is not so awful, a woman in my office told me. She once lived in India and knew wherever she spoke. At Samuel's funeral, a priest told me, I don't envy you boys. This is your enterprise now, your vocation. He kissed me as if sex between us was an option he held, then rode to the altar on a billow of white to a solitary place setting meant to serve us all. Enzo's temperature remained the same through the night. I poured myself a drink, though I did not need it, to push myself over the edge of feeling. I took it down to the beach. There were still a few bright stars in the sky. Everything was shaded in rose, including the waves and the footprints in the sand, deceiving me and the men coming home from dancing into anticipating a beautiful day. Since the deaths began, the social workers have quoted Shakespeare at us. Give sorrow words. But the words we now use reek of old air in churches, taste of the dust that is gathered in the crevices of the Nativity and the Passion. Our condolences, arid as leaves. We are actors who have over-rehearsed our lines. When I left the island one beautiful weekend, Noah said, were you so close to this man that you have to go to his funeral? I told myself all the way to Philadelphia that I did not have to justify my mourning. One is responsible for feeling something and being done with it. Give sorrow occasion and let it go, or your heart will imprison you in constant February, a chain link fence around frozen soil, where your dead will stack in towers past the point of grieving. Let your tears fall for the dead, and as one who is suffering, begin the lament. Do not neglect his burial. Think of him, the one you loved, on his knees, on his elbows, his face turned back up to look in yours, his dark mouth in his dark beard. He was smiling because of you. You tied a silky rope around his wrists, then down around the base of his cock and balls, his anus raised for you. Then you put your mouth against it, you ceased to exist. All else fell away. You had brought him and he you to that point where you were most your mind and most your body. His prostate pulsed against your fingers like a heart in a cave. Mind, body, body, mind, over and over. Looking down at him, he who is dead and gone, then lying across the broken bridge of his spine, the beachhead of his back, you would gladly change places with him. Let your weeping be bitter and your wailing fervent, then be comforted for your sorrow. Find in grief the abandon you used to find in love. Grieve the way you used to fuck. Thank you.
Well, we'll close out this event by reading the eulogy from Barnett's funeral. Please welcome Ron.
So a picture of a dark fall day at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and we're backwards in the auditorium. And there's a beautiful rose window behind us as we speak. A eulogy for Alan Barnett. I found when I started going through Alan's address book, making calls, that almost everyone in it had a singular, peculiar relationship with him in a social vacuum. Something on the order of 260 announcements went out from Beverly Hills to Berlin to men and women he knew and cared about, most of whom could easily have believed that they were his closest friends. Those were only the ones who were still alive. I shudder to think of how many of the 300,000 people who have died from the effects of AIDS knew Alan. There wouldn't be room for them all here. I am the person who spoke with many of you around the time of his death and told you a little bit about how he died. The common wisdom is that I took care of him in the final days of his illness, but the truth is much more complicated than that. In fact, we took care of each other. Through him and with him, I learned an immense amount about AIDS and his particular complications, about his life, about compassion, sensitivity, and about love in extreme circumstances. I have learned that death is not ghoulish, nor is it poignant, but the end of hard, dull work whose only rewards are presence and closeness, and finally, consciousness of inevitability. If I am better off for having been so close to him then, now I feel his absence very acutely indeed. Alan Barnett was a small guy with a bright smile, a lyrical, arresting voice, and what Robert Patrick said were upside-down eyes. His smile, as you can see from the photo on the program, was utterly intoxicating. He could and did use it to great effect a couple of hours before he died. His sneer, which I have also seen on a few occasions, was enough to curdle milk and inspire a little fear in me. Alan was a beautiful man, not in a conventional way, who had an ageless face and the most penetrating gaze I've ever had to meet. Alan, who took pains to invent himself, was a moralist, an aesthete. He had an ever-changing, unrelenting aesthetic ideology. He believed not so much that in the goodness of beautiful things, but rather in the inherent beauty of goodness, excellence, clarity. He had a favorite everything and was a great repository for musical, literary, and visual advice. He had favorite recipes, and I had thought a month ago that the best tribute to him might have been to have gotten together here at the high altar and had a buffet of pasta with pignoli nuts, basil, garlic, sun-dried tomatoes, and anchovies, with a side of escarole. Alan and I shared a lust for comfort, that most fleeting of middle-class values, and it broke my heart when in the hospital he had so much trouble finding a position he could relax in. In his hospital room, he was propped up looking at a dreadful laminated reproduction of a family of partridges, a la Currier and Ives. Then when his first roommate moved out and we switched to the window, he was stuck with a sun-blinched Dufy Marinescape. In an effort to personalize his room a little, I brought the only thing that I had mounted, an old film noir poster showing a forlorn woman and a brooding man in evening clothes on a Paris rooftop. It stayed up a week, but a couple of days before he died, he called me over and said, "Ron, honey, that picture of yours is beginning to depress me." He asked me to bring the etching that hung over his couch at home. It seems emblematic that he hadn't lost his humanity, his taste, his sense that beauty mattered, and that the absence of it could take precedence over his physical struggle. It was one of his last requests that we gather here. I was frankly exhausted by the demands of his illness and terrified of leaving him alone. When he had decided to start the morphine drip that would both soothe him and possibly sedate him to the point that he would no longer be able to speak, that might suppress his already labored breathing, he asked me how I felt about the decision. He gave me the chance to tell him. His hand that I held continuously and deliberately for so many hours held my hand back with new strength. He knew I needed to know that he cared for me. I still need to know that. He had strong, soft hands, and I missed them. I met Alan through a mutual friend, Phil Gamboni, who introduced us over breakfast in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Phil told me a little about Alan's book, about St. Martin's having nominated it for the Pulitzer. Alan smiled and said very little. We walked through Harvard Yard, and Alan and I lagged behind and talked. I wish I could remember what we said. He impressed me immediately, and although was always a little in awe of him, for one thing, he spoke in perfect crystalline English sentences, I knew he was accessible to me. Within 24 hours, I had read The Body and Its Dangers, and I knew I was in the presence of a great writer as well. I called him when I had read it, and we immediately became friends. He inscribed this in my copy later on. Older writers told me that my life wouldn't change when my book came out. Well, I met you because of it, and that should count for something. I write this with gratitude for that meeting, a cold morning in Cambridge before the coffee had kicked in. I woke up at the table and there you were. Thank you for managing your way into this journey. The book, after all, is only the sound of one hand clapping. At first, I would hardly have known he had other friends. Many of you and others who are not here have realized that he kept most of us in orbit around him, and we seldom met each other through him. His apartment was furnished to accommodate the inhabitant and one very special guest, a combination I think he must have thought sacred. Whoever spent time with him could never have felt anything less than the absolute center of his formidable attention. This treatment I found to be a profound and generous act of love, and its absence a loss I can just bear because I have felt it. When you were alone with Alan, you could not feel lonely, bored, or disengaged. His trust was palpable. He believed that indifference, contrary to poetic belief, was the worst we had to fear, and never allowed it near him. He was passionate about his work and was patient and generous enough to share it without condescension. He was sweet and difficult, honest and brilliantly conniving. His need for love was somehow more obvious than for others, and that was upsetting sometimes, refreshing at others. He was never cloying or pitiful. He was sharp and defiant and strong-willed and soft-hearted. We have plenty left to argue about, and I will wait a long time for anyone who will challenge me the way he did. Please take your memories of Alan, of his immense complexity, into your hearts, minds, and souls, and hold him close to you always. Be grateful that you knew him, however well you knew him. Realize that he has left us great gifts. Take credit for having been chosen to be a part of his life. Hold within you his contrariness, with his magnanimity, his wisdom, with his innocence, his joy and sadness, courage and fear. Cut the platitudes. They are too crude to describe him. Never speak of what Alan would have done or what he would have wanted, because the only thing we know for certain is that he should have been healthy, that he should be alive right now to tell us with style and grace how we could possibly begin to register the loss of him. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We have books from Rebel Satori that you've just heard from at the back by the register. Thank you for joining us today.